Elara Vance pressed her palms hard against her temples, fighting the searing pain that radiated from her right ear. The locomotive's whistle didn't cut the air. It sliced directly into her sensory nerves. Her mild hyperacusis turned the Cheyenne depot, the screeching iron wheels, the rough shouts, the boots grinding stone into a torture chamber. Acoustic chaos. She clutched her battered seamstress's kit box, a heavy wooden anchor against the swirling world. Though she masked her anguish with a composed face, she knew someone was watching. The instinct of a person forced to survive in silence told her so. "Miss Vance!" Elara turned, confronting Mrs. Beatrice Shaw, whose voice, though brisk, was mercifully low. "Mr. Kincaid was unfortunately detained. There's been a slight adjustment." Mrs. Shaw's eyes, devoid of warmth, surveyed Elara's simple traveling suit. "We must depart immediately. He has matters concerning the rail lines to resolve at Redwood Pass." Rail lines. Elara felt the lie settle in the air like dust. Garrett Kincaid's letters had promised cattle drives and homesteading. The secret map hidden in her sewing kitnya truth, she had not sought but had been given, whispered of land disputes and power. As Elara followed Mrs. Shaw, she noted the sudden drop in the wind, the brief clear sunlight on the depot's platform, and the strong, metallic smell of engine oil mixing with dry sage. The world seemed to hold its breath. It was then she saw it, a dark blue embroidered handkerchief snagged on a wagon axle. She reached out, capturing the linen before the wind claimed it. It belonged to Lara Finch. And stitched onto the corner was the code, a double-knotted stitch placed diagonally. Warning, betrayal. Ilaria's breath hitched. Not only had Lyra warned her, Lyra had known the truth and had bought her silence. Elara squeezed the linen until the threads bit into her palm. Her journey across a continent to escape the betrayals of comfort had led her only to a frontier bargain built on deceit. She lifted her chin, her eyes no longer shadowed by pain, fixed on the vast Wyoming expanse. Silence had not killed her. It had taught her to listen for the truth amidst the thousand lies. This marriage wasn't salvation. It was a frontier bargain built on deceit. This wasn't the end of her journey. This was the opening move of a high-stakes game of survival. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, spring 1880. Elara Vance lived in a world most others could not perceive. At 28, she wore silence not as a flaw but as armor. Her mild hyperacusis turned ordinary life into a relentless assault. The sound of the church bell rang at noon, and her world didn't just vibrate. It splintered behind her eyes. She adopted a precise regimen, slow movements, soft-soled shoes, and responses kept to the minimum. This constant self-regulation was mistaken for shyness. She was a woman of acute observation, capable of hearing a dropped pin across a room, yet terrified of a raised voice. Her sanctuary had been the seamstress's nook, the shop her mother, Martha Vance, had left her. Among the fabrics, Elara found control. Her worth here was measured by perfectly executed stitches and the meticulous order of her financial ledgers. Skills that required quiet concentration, not loud assertion. Mrs. Cecilia Harrington, the mayor's wife, was the voice of Portsmouth's judgment. "Miss Vance," Mrs. Harrington declared one Tuesday, the jangle of her gold bracelets, a piercing, high-frequency assault, preceding her into the shop. "The board believes the town needs someone with spirit, someone who can attract the right sort of clientele. Your demeanor, it simply doesn't inspire confidence in commerce." Mrs. Harrington confused Elara's sensory caution with a fundamental lack of drive. Elara merely nodded, the effort of constructing a diplomatic reply a painful cost. The silence confirmed their prejudice. She knew her defense needed to change. She had learned that silence was not submission, it was preservation. Professor Elias Thorne, a retired scholar, was the only man who saw her intelligence, not her quietude. He arrived one evening, carrying a satchel and a hushed urgency. "Elara, this town will choke you," he whispered. "Garrett Kincaid in Wyoming. Go." He didn't stop at the want ad. He placed a worn copy of a book in her hands. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of leather, a detailed map of the contested lands in the Wyoming Territory. Professor Thorne looked her straight in the eye. Do not trust the surface, Elara. Learn the lines before you cross them. Knowledge is your armor. The mystery of the map and the professor's quiet insistence resonated more deeply than any threat from Mrs. Harrington. Lyra Finch, burdened by her Uncle Silas Finch's secret investments, attended her final lesson with Elara. She respected Elara, but was trapped by fear. Lyra couldn't speak the truth, that Garrett Kincaid needed an administrator to stabilize his new, risky ventures, not a simple wife. Instead, she produced a dark blue handkerchief. As Elara watched, Lyra added a final, tiny flourish. Near a double-knotted diagonal stitch, the secret signal for warning. Lyra's face was a mask of sorrow. She had upheld her duty to her family, but she had betrayed her teacher. Elara accepted the handkerchief, sensing Lyra's grief. She gently tucked it beside her shears in the kit box, as if neatness could guard her from uncertainty. Elara sat at her desk, the gaslight humming faintly. She drafted her reply to Kincaid. The first attempts, filled with defensive explanations, were torn apart. The final letter was concise and strategic. She listed her administrative skills, her meticulous focus, and her ability to work independently. She reframed her quiet nature. My need for quiet fosters observation and focus, abilities invaluable in the management of complex affairs. It was a proposal, not a plea. She performed her final symbolic act. She took down the sign. The church bell rang its final call at sunset, but Elara did not flinch. She simply signed her name, Elara Vance, and closed the door. She hadn't controlled the words of Portsmouth, but she could control her destination. She was done being misunderstood. Now she would ensure she was precisely calculated. Elara's final moments in Portsmouth were dictated by Silas Finch's carriage drawing up near grating, loud sound that felt like grit rubbing in her ears. The treasurer's booming, overly formal farewell compounded her physical pain. A new life, Miss Vance. A new chance. Mr. Kincaid assures me it's a fine arrangement. A fine, profitable arrangement for all involved. Elara nodded, her face composed. She saw not a well-wisher, but the man whose greed had silenced Lyra. She placed the dark blue handkerchief, tracing the knots of betrayal, back into the seamstress's kit box, right on top of the secret map. She would not speak the accusation. She would observe the consequences. The first draft of her reply to Kincaid, which she retrieved from the stove, was verbose and weak. Its self-pitying tone now felt foreign. The cost of words was too high, acoustically and strategically. On the Hartford platform, Elara reviewed her final letter. It contained no personal sentiment, only a clean, concise outline of her skills. It was a strategy born of self-preservation, not desperation. She had framed her hyperacusis as an asset. My necessity for quiet fosters acute observation and breeds a focus on detail that others find distracting. I require a home environment conducive to concentration, and in return, I offer unwavering dedication to organization and efficiency. This was the language of an administrator demanding respect. She had controlled the output. She had used silence to control the narrative. The letter was a contract drafted on her own terms of engagement. Back in Portsmouth, Lyra Finch's guilt was a physical knot in her stomach. Her needle hovered above her linen, trembling. She had sown a lie, not a lesson. She had known the truth. Kincaid needs her not for babies, but for balance. He needed her intellect to quiet the local dissenters and manage the fraudulent claims. Lyra, by warning Elara, had risked her family's wealth. By sending Elara away, she had protected her uncle's secrets. Her action was a desperate gamble rooted in divided loyalty. She could only pray Elara was smart enough to read the subtle code she had sewn into the linen. The train ride was a marathon of acoustic pain and intellectual discipline. Leaving Hartford, Elara sought refuge in the rhythmic roar of the engine, forcing her mind to accept the constant noise as a new demanding beat. The scent of hot iron and scorched coal filled her throat, sharp as betrayal itself. The initial days across New York and Pennsylvania were a study in sensory endurance. Every shouted instruction, every child's cry, and every conversation felt like a blunt instrument chipping away at her resolve. She employed her deepest concentration techniques, focusing her entire attention on the vibration of the steel carriage, treating the external sounds as a distant, unintelligible hum. She observed the other passengers, families moving toward hope, prospectors moving toward quick fortune, and widows moving toward necessity. She was moving toward a calculated necessity. Her solitude became a shield, but also a lens. She saw the minute details others missed, the flicker of anxiety in a father's eyes, the way a newly married woman nervously twisted her wedding band. Her quietude gave her peripheral vision into the human heart. Somewhere over the vast, monotonous plains of Nebraska, the constant clatter of the train became less a trauma and more a pulse of endurance. Elara sensed the landscape change, the air growing drier, the sky expanding into an impossibly large dome. It was here, suspended between the civilizations she had fled and the wildness she approached, that she allowed herself to address the silent threat. She spread the blue handkerchief on her narrow berth. She studied the double-knotted diagonal stitch. The stitch, a private cipher they had crafted years ago, carried the full weight of Lyra's panic. When the thread is knotted twice, the truth is tied down. When the knot crosses the angle, the path is crossed by deceit. Lyra Vance's betrayal was now a confirmed fact, a data point. Elara did not allow herself the luxury of anger. Anger was noise. Instead, she retrieved the leather-bound map. Professor Thornmore's gift was not sentimental. It was a mandate for survival. Elara spent the next 3 days in near total silence, engrossed in the map. She was no longer reading a geographical document. She was reading Garrett Kincaid's mind and ambition. She compared the established ranch boundaries with the densely marked proposed rail spurs. The spurs did not serve the ranch. They served mineral deposits and valuable water crossings. Kincaid was not primarily a rancher. He was an industrial opportunist using the ranch fade as a legal and social defense. Elara realized her skills bookkeeping, attention to detail, and a disarming lack of presence were perfect for managing fraudulent claims and quieting local dissent without attracting federal attention. He needed a silent, intelligent shield. She began her covert operation. Using the thinnest white silk thread from her kit, she annotated the map on the linen border. She used her craft, the language of women, easily dismissed, to chart strategy. Tiny, discreet embroidery stitches became her war markings. A simple star knot marked the most likely point of legal leverage. A French knot indicated a documented water right infringement. She was now a covert intelligence officer, turning her domestic art into reconnaissance. As the train crossed into the Wyoming territory, the environment became a different kind of loud, wild, sharp, and non-rhythmic. The wind roared like a beast across the endless plains. The train echoed thunderously through mountain cuts, and the high, sharp cries of unseen birds were piercing. This tested her hyperacusis severely, forcing her to rely fully on her discipline. However, the hyperacusis began to transform. Because she could sense the subtle shifts in air pressure and vibration earlier than anyone, she could anticipate the sound. Her curse was evolving into a perverse early warning system. She used the predictable surge of the wind to brace herself, training her body to absorb the shock. She arrived at the Cheyenne Depot physically exhausted but strategically hardened. The chaos of the station, the noise, the motion, the smells of the crowd and oil was overwhelming, but she filtered it with surgical precision. She saw Mrs. Shaw. She heard the lie. And when her hand closed over Lyra's handkerchief, the final internal confirmation was immediate. She looked out at the jagged, beautiful, and deceiving mountains. She knew her role, and she embraced the danger with a quiet, fierce resolve. She was done surviving sound. It was time to weaponize it. The journey from Cheyenne Depot to Redwood Pass in Samuel Blackwood Audio's wagon was a punishing continuation of Elara's acoustic test. Mrs. Beatrice Shaw sat beside her, her presence a weight of granite. Mrs. Shaw's voice, gravelly and dry, was a relentless drone of frontier practicality. Crop yields, claim disputes, the harshness of the recent winter. Elara endured the noise by turning her attention outward. The vastness of the Wyoming plains was staggering, beautiful, but terrifyingly exposed. The air tasted of dry dust and limitless space. This landscape offered no hiding places. Mrs. Shaw offered the confirming details Elara needed. "Garrett's a forward thinker," she said, nodding toward the rugged, distant hills. The ranch is fine, but the future is in transport. That rail spur he is fighting for, it's the lifeline. Fighting? Elara asked, pitching her soft voice perfectly to cut through the dry wind without straining her throat. Oh yes, the local ranchers hate his claims on the water crossings. But they cannot argue with a woman who can keep records, can they? Mrs. Shaw gave her a sharp, knowing look. He needs a steady hand to deal with the paper side of the fighting. The Redwood Pass settlement was a tenacious cluster of log and stone. The Blackwood-Sown homestead was clean and quiet, offering Elara a few hours of desperately needed sensory relief. The silence in the small room was broken only by the hollow, anxious creak of the rough-hewn floorboards, a controllable sound. That evening, Elara sat alone. She retrieved her secret map and the handkerchief. The warning was clear. The purpose of her marriage was defined. She was hired to quiet Kincaid's enemies. She began to plan, using her hyperacusis as a tactical advantage. She closed her eyes, separating the sounds, the distant sigh of the wind, the low rumble of the Blackwood's voices, the unique, faint drumming of her own pulse in her ears. Her affliction was forcing her into a state of total environmental awareness. Garrett Kincaid did not return that evening, but Elara knew he was close. She went to the window, the frigid night air a balm to her senses. She did not see him, but she heard him, a distinct, low creak of leather and steel a long distance away, followed by the faint, muffled click of a rifle mechanism being engaged and disengaged. The sounds were too precise, too deliberate for a casual rider. The silence of the vast plains magnified the menace. Elara smiled faintly, a private, cold acknowledgement of the game. Kincaid was not delayed by business. He was assessing her behavior under isolation. She walked to the center of the room, her spine straight, ensuring her shadow was visible through the thin curtain. She slowly, deliberately began to unpick one of the tight, unnecessary seams on her skirt. It was a visible declaration of calm, a signal to her hidden watcher. She would not break. She would only meticulously redesign the structure she inhabited. Garrett Kincaid arrived before dawn, not with a flourish, but with a sudden, purposeful thud of boots on the Blackwood-Sown porch noise that immediately sent a spike of searing pain through Elara's skull. He was a physically formidable man, his clothing functional and rough. Under his rugged exterior, however, was a gaze quick and sharp, like a man long accustomed to reading intent before reading words. He did not apologize. "Miss Vance, glad you made it. Beatrice says you're quite settled." His voice was deep and steady, but possessed a resonant quality that felt physically taxing for Elara. Elara met his gaze, deliberately regulating her breath and her auditory threshold. Her response was soft, clear, and utterly devoid of expected sentiment. "Mr. Kincaid, the journey was acceptable. I have questions regarding the correspondence relating to the water rights mentioned in your original solicitation." The direct administrative language halted Kincaid. Kincaid led her to the parlor and dropped a stack of documents onto a wooden table. The impact of wood on wood reverberated in Elara's skull like a struck bell. She fought the impulse to flinch. "Let's be plain, Miss Vance," Kincaid said, leaning forward. "This is Wyoming. I need a woman who can quiet the noise. The paper noise, the public noise. While I lay the rail, the local ranchers are petitioning Congress. I need someone to manage the records, handle the correspondence, and present a respectable, non-threatening face to the territory." Elara did not open her mouth immediately. She carefully used her fingers to measure the thickness of the stack, calculating the workload. The initial agreement, Elara stated, her voice steady, was based on the pretense of a simple homesteading operation. The current situation involves significant legal conflict and financial exposure regarding water rights. She did not wait for his defense. "My services are worth more than the domestic rate, Mr. Kincaid. I accept this arrangement. But it is not a traditional marriage. It is a strategic partnership. My silence is my armor. It will also be your shield. In return, I require absolute control over my working environment, assurance of privacy, and a guarantee that no sudden or unnecessary acoustic disturbances will be tolerated in the homestead." Kincaid stared at her, a flicker of grudging respect in his slate eyes. The timid spinster was presenting him with a corporate contract in terms of silence. "Done," Kincaid clipped. "You manage the inside, I manage the outside. We will be married tomorrow. You will be Mrs. Kincaid, the quiet, efficient lady running the home. That's your job. The rest is simply bookkeeping." As he turned to leave, Elara had one final move. "Mr. Kincaid," she called, her voice just above a whisper. He froze. "The Raven!" Kincaid whirled around. The Raven was the assumed name of the powerful, unseen rival attempting to sabotage his rail ventures. A name known only to his closest inner circle. "How in God's name do you know that name?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. Elara offered him a faint, strategic smile. "I listen closely, Mr. Kincaid, and I study the opposition's map." The next morning, the wedding was a brief, sterile affair. Elara Vance became Mrs. Kincaid, the quiet, necessary administrator. She moved into Kincaid's new ranch house, a formidable structure that was quiet but raw. Her first act was to demand the removal of a heavy pendulum clock. Its rhythmic tock-tock-tock would have been a maddening, tiny torture. Kincaid, stunned by the singularity of the request, complied immediately. Elara set up her workspace, a dry study where she meticulously organized Kincaid's chaotic paperwork. She placed her seamstress's kit box and the secret map prominently on her desk. The rules were hers. The silence in the Kincaid house was thick and strategic. Elara held her bargain with chilling efficiency. Her records were immaculate. Her correspondence was perfectly phrased, appearing gentle and non-confrontational, while firmly defending Kincaid's legal claims. Kincaid found the silence unnerving. He was used to the noise of control. He began to notice Elara's habits, the preternatural stillness of her hands, the way she anticipated a sudden noise. He was starting to respect her quiet control. One afternoon, Kincaid brought home a loud, aggressive foreman named Jed. As Jed started to argue a point, his voice hitting a high, grating pitch, Elara simply stopped moving. Her hands clenched slightly, her face a mask of intense sensory pain. Kincaid, recognizing the subtle, powerful change in her posture, immediately cut the foreman short. "Jed," Kincaid said flatly, his own voice unnaturally low, "speak slower and lower. My wife requires a working environment conducive to concentration. We discussed this." The foreman, stunned, lowered his volume. Elara offered Kincaid a small, almost imperceptible nod confirmation of their alliance. Kincaid realized that Elara's affliction was her strength. It was a constant, hyper-vigilant sensor that forced her to be perpetually aware and prepared. Elara Vance, now Mrs. Kincaid, stood at the window of her new home. In the silence, she began to sew a fine, tight seam on the cuff of her sleeve, stitch a strategy. Her silence had not killed her. It had honed her. And in the Wild West, survival was the only currency that mattered. Elara's new role as Mrs. Kincaid was immediately defined by the absolute silence she demanded in her study. Her work was a ruthless application of logic and detail. Kincaid's papers, a chaotic jumble of deeds, correspondence, and hastily scribbled legal notes, were tamed into perfectly indexed ledgers. Her correspondence was equally effective, formal, polite, and legally impeccable, subtly challenging the claims of the local ranchers without resorting to threats or emotional language. She treated the disputes surrounding the rail spurs like a complex embroidery pattern. Every lawsuit, every water use document was a thread she had to track, knot, or cut. The secret map was her primary reference, confirmed by the public records she meticulously reviewed. She discovered that Kincaid's claim strategy often relied on exploiting small, easily overlooked legal inconsistencies in the original homestead filings. Garrett Kincaid, initially skeptical of Elara's ability, was quickly forced to acknowledge her value. He was a man of action, noise, and external power. She was a woman of meticulous detail, silence, and internal power. He began relying on her assessments. "This petition from the Miller Ranch, what's the angle?" he'd ask, his deep voice deliberately lowered when he entered her study. Elara would not speak immediately. She'd point to a specific ledger entry or tap a precisely marked spot on the secret map. Her amber eyes, usually soft, hardened with cold precision. Their primary water source is dependent on a 1872 federal easement, which is not correctly recorded in the county register. My letter drafted yesterday redirects their complaint toward the federal oversight, stalling the local litigation. Kincaid found himself utterly dependent on her quiet, unwavering accuracy. The emotional distance was profound, yet the professional respect was growing rapidly. He knew she held him to the contract. He also knew she was the only person who understood the true fragility of his rail ambitions. The first serious challenge came not from the ranchers, but from a telegram delivered one windy afternoon. The message was from Kincaid's legal representative in Cheyenne, hinting at a potential sabotage attempt by the Raven aimed at Kincaid's supply lines. Kincaid stormed into the house, slamming the front door, a deafening noise that caused Elara to instinctively flinch and press her hands to her ears. The sound was a raw, physical intrusion, blinding her for a painful second. He stopped, seeing the raw physical agony on her face. For the first time, Kincaid saw her condition not as an eccentricity, but as a severe vulnerability. He forced his voice into a low rumble. "The Raven is making a move. I need you to scan everything, any recent correspondence that mentions supply runs or freight. Anything out of the ordinary." Elara nodded, pushing the pain back with sheer discipline. She took the telegram, her hands steady. She immediately turned to her files, transforming the sensory trauma into focused energy. Elara worked through the night. The silence of the ranch house became a pressurized chamber for her investigation. Using her hyperacusis, she filtered the wind noise and listened only for the minute sounds of the house, Kincaid pacing, the settling of the foundation sounds that indicated stress and urgency. She meticulously cross-referenced supply orders with payment dates and delivery routes. Her internal radar guided her. She found it. An invoice for specialized freight equipment, paid for a month in advance, routed not to the main ranch, but to a deserted way station known for low visibility and minimal travel. She placed the invoice on Kincaid's desk. When he returned exhausted, he saw it immediately. "This route," Elara whispered, pointing to the map where she had marked the way station with a delicate blood-red French knot. "It avoids the main settlement entirely. It's perfect for interception. The payment date is anomalous." Kincaid stared at her, his slate eyes widening in realization. "They're going to hit the supply before it even reaches the rail line. How did you spot this?" "I check for patterns of inconsistency," Elara stated simply. "The quiet details." Kincaid quickly dispatched a separate security detail. The operation was executed with cold precision. No shots were fired publicly, only silent security measures. The next day, the mail delivery included a local newspaper that briefly mentioned unusual activity near the way station, confirming the Raven's failed ambush. Elara Vance's quiet work had yielded tangible, physical results. Kincaid did not thank Elara with words. Words were cheap. Instead, he made a series of subtle, tangible changes. He replaced the squeaky hinge on the cellar door. He started using a small, soft belnya sound that was gentle and contained to signal his need for her rather than his loud calls. When their eyes met across the study, there was no affection, but a new, heavy connection. It was the silent recognition between two people who know each other, deepest vulnerability, and their most formidable strength. Their alliance, founded on deception and contract, was now cemented by mutual necessity and a shared, unspoken understanding of the high cost of noise and the invaluable nature of quiet precision. Elara had found her power in the chaos of the Wild West. Based on the established plot and the required total word count, 8,500 words, the remaining segment of the story needs to cover the final conflicts, the ultimate reveal of the full conspiracy, and the resolution of Elara's position. The silent alliance between Elara and Kincaid successfully stalled the ranchers' litigation and thwarted the Raven's initial sabotage. But the relative peace was short-lived. A new threat emerged, a sudden, aggressive push from the Union Pacific Railroad to seize Kincaid's disputed lands, citing ambiguous paperwork provided by a third party. Elara immediately recognized the escalation. The Union Pacific wasn't an ordinary rival. They were powerful enough to absorb Kincaid whole. The move was too precise, too well-timed. The source of the ambiguous paperwork was the key. They're using a claim from 1868 related to mineral rights in Section 14, Kincaid stated, his frustration audible in a sound Elara braced herself against. It contradicts the Homestead Act filings. I never saw this deed. Elara took the Union Pacific document. She recognized the signature style of the penmanship. It was highly formal, almost decorative. She had seen it before, not on a legal document, but on a piece of personal correspondence her mother had once received. Elara retreated to her study, not to fight the noise, but to seek the deepest silence. She opened her seamstress's kit box, ignoring the meticulously organized tools. She pulled out the secret map and the accompanying papers Professor Thorne had provided. She compared the handwriting on the Union Pacific challenge to a small note tucked inside Thorne Bureau's documents, TRI receipt for surveying services. The handwriting matched. The name on the receipt was Silas Finch. The realization struck her with the force of a silent explosion. Silas Finch, Lyra's uncle, had orchestrated the entire chain of events. He had used Kincaid as an initial investor, used the ambiguity of the land claims, and was now leveraging the Union Pacific, the ultimate power, to profit from the resulting chaos. He hadn't just betrayed Elara, he had betrayed Kincaid, Lyra, and the trust of Portsmouth. Elara knew she couldn't rely on shouting or even formal accusations. Finch operated in the shadows of quiet bureaucracy. She needed to use his own weapon, the quiet detailing against him. Elara worked for 48 hours straight. She didn't rely on Kincaid's deeds, which were compromised. She used Professor Thorne's documents, which detailed the original, correct surveys. Her countermove was not a loud lawsuit, but a single devastating piece of documentation. She meticulously recreated a corrective land survey addendum, using her knowledge of formal legal draftsmanship and her talent for mimicking precise penmanship. She then took the small, correct original receipt signed by Silas Finch from Thorne's papers and attached it to the addendum. The combination effectively tied the initial fraudulent survey directly back to Finch's financial dealings with Kincaid, creating a legal liability that far outweighed the Union Pacific's gain. When Kincaid saw the single document, his face was unreadable. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "It is the truth, Mr. Kincaid," Elara said, her voice clear. "Proof that the 1868 claim was deliberately obscured for private gain, tying the paper trail directly back to its source, and Silas Finch." Kincaid looked at her, not as his employee, but as his equal, perhaps even his superior. He saw the architect of his survival. Kincaid did not send the document to the courts. He sent it directly to the legal counsel of the Union Pacific Railroad and a private letter to Silas Finch in Portsmouth. The effect was instantaneous and silent. The Union Pacific, wary of involving themselves in a scandal that touched powerful Eastern financiers, quietly withdrew their lawsuit. Silas Finch, facing financial ruin and public exposure of his corruption, vanished from Portsmouth. The dust settled, and the silence in the Kincaid house deepened. Not the silence of tension, but the silence of control and victory. One evening, weeks later, Kincaid entered Elara's study. He did not slam the door or call out. He paused, his boots making a soft, deliberate thud-thud on the rugna, courtesy he had learned. "The Union Pacific is out," he stated, his voice flat, "and Finch is gone. The property is secured legitimately." He sat across from her. He did not offer thanks, which she would have dismissed. Instead, he simply presented her with a large, leather-bound volume, new, blank ledger, perfect for her meticulous work. "I need you to manage the new venture," Kincaid said, meeting her eyes. "A permanent arrangement. This time, no pretenses. It's a partnership, equal shares, equal control of the domestic and legal spheres." Elara looked at the ledger, its crisp white pages awaiting her command. She looked at Kincaid. She saw a man who respected her mind, revered her control, and had learned to adapt to her truth. "The terms are acceptable, Mr. Kincaid," she replied softly, "but the acoustic environment must remain conducive to concentration. And you must understand that my loyalty is to the truth of the ledgers, not merely to your ambition." "I understand," he nodded. "The truth of the ledgers is the only thing that saved us." Elara Vance, now firmly Mrs. Kincaid, had not found romance, but she had achieved something far more vital. sovereignty and respect. She had transformed her greatest physical vulnerability into her ultimate strategic weapon. She picked up a needle and thread, not to sew a new code, but to carefully mend a loose button on her husband's coat, small domestic task performed with professional precision. She realized the essence of her journey. She had escaped the clamor of Portsmouth and the expectation that she be seen and heard. In the rough silence of the West, she had taught a powerful man the value of listening and had built an empire on the strength of unspoken truth. Her survival was complete. Her dominion, built on the finest thread of intelligence and the deepest silence, had just begun.